Hi folks, I'm just going to read you a short excerpt from a chapter in my book, Universe. It won't take long. When I read this, some of you might start going, is this where you're going now, Darrell? Hold that thought. Everything is not quite as it seems, but I'd rather explain after I read this rather than before. This chapter marks something of a departure from the highly technical and scientific nature of the book overall. So the whole book doesn't read like this. Just bear with me. Here we go. There was no beginning. There was always God. He was all-powerful, but that didn't mean anything because there was nothing for him to have power over. He was all-knowing, but there wasn't anything for him to know about except himself. He was all-seeing, but he felt completely blind because there was nothing to see. His presence was everywhere, but everywhere was nowhere because nothing else existed except him. Although God was the supreme being, residing in the blinding glory of his own eternal existence, this was meaningless because there was no one and nothing below or above him. He felt as small as an unborn baby asleep in its mother's womb. His life was utterly lifeless. So he thought, I will create. But there was a snag. He didn't have any material to work with. He didn't even have any space to put anything. All that existed was God. So anything he made would be himself. He tried creating something, but it was impossible because it could not be separated from the light of his own presence. Then he thought of a neat trick. He did something that was not quite an act of creation, but a pulling back of his own being, forming a bubble of absence. As a test, he pushed his presence into one side of the bubble to see what absence felt like. It didn't feel like anything. There was nothing to see, just like before. While continuing to gaze into the bubble, he decided to peer into the opposite side at the same time. Suddenly a face appeared, as if out of nowhere. "Who are you?" God cried out. The shape responded, "Me? And just who are you?" God pulled back in alarm. Looking across the bubble, he hadn't been able to recognize himself. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating and immensely interesting. In an existence that consisted of nothing but himself, he couldn't imagine anything more interesting, except perhaps doing the same thing on a much larger scale. So that's just what he did. God threw his presence into the bubble with reckless abandon. And the more of himself he inserted, the larger the bubble grew. The effect was like a massive explosion. He saw himself in all of the individual pieces, but none of the bits realized that they were him. Some fragments fought each other and destroyed themselves, yet this destruction was also a transformation into something new. Those fragments that got along were especially interesting because they started forming strange and fascinating relationships. Eventually, this settled down into planets that orbited around stars, which arranged themselves into galaxies. This stability was always under threat by the sheer diversity of all the things that now existed. Sometimes a huge chunk of rock would collide with a planet and cause massive damage. Occasionally, a star would become so heavy that it would collapse in on itself and start pulling in anything else that got too close. The universe was a fencing match between order and chaos, with neither side ever able to win outright. Even more interesting events started happening on the surfaces of some of the planets. Tiny cells worked together, established a rapport with their environment, and eventually built themselves into creatures. Their lives were just as chaotic as the rest of the universe. They discovered they had to eat other living things just to stay alive. All sorts of variety emerged, some creatures learning to collaborate with other species, while others opted for a more isolated and aggressive approach. Those whose bodies were structured in a manner that gave them an advantage in fighting or defense got to survive, while the weaker forms died and were never seen again. Even this only made the situation more interesting, because over time the creatures took on more complex and amazing shapes. One of these was humankind. As God watched the lives of the humans, he saw them loving and hating and creating all sorts of drama. He knew that every one of them was himself, but he didn't tell them the big secret. The whole game had depended on this pretense from the beginning. But these creatures were persistent. Some of them figured out the truth just a little bit, and they would try to talk to God as if he were a separate person from them. Others attempted to reach him using meditation techniques or mind-altering substances. But who or what do you expect to find? God felt like asking them. I am you. And if I wasn't down there having these wonderful experiences as you, I would be all alone forever in a great big nowhere. Don't you get it? There's nothing up here with me. You're what makes me truly alive. So stop trying to find me. You are me. I put you down there so that I could live. Some, in their quest to find God, got hung up on mystical experiences and spent their lives pursuing those, not realizing that the whole point of living was to have a life. Some spent so much time contemplating another plane of existence that they spoiled life by neglecting to live it fully. Human lives were not built to last, and people were sometimes glum about that. They felt they should go on living forever. This was an understandable feeling, since they were God in disguise. Some humans overcame this sadness by making up stories about going to a better place when they died. Others saw themselves as jumping into a new body when their present life was over. But the really smart ones understood that they were inside every body at the same time. Only the experience of unity was walled off, except in those occasional weird moments when one of them could tell what another was thinking, or when they made something happen that wasn't ordinarily supposed to be possible. They were God in disguise, playing a game of separateness. They realized that they didn't have to worry about their little life winking out. It was just like forgetting one experience to make room for new ones. After all, they were everybody all at once. Just like bodies, God didn't make the universe to last. Eventually, he will pull all the separate parts of himself together again, and there will only be him alone as it was before. And that situation will be as uninteresting as it always was. So he will play the game again. He always has, and he always will. Okay, I'm not sure what you thought about that. If you're a Christian and you encounter something like that, it's called Genesis Rebooted. So it's like my rewriting of Scripture, if you like. What am I trying to say? That I am inspired by God to write Holy Scripture that you should take as inerrant truth? No, not at all. It's myth. Now, a lot of people think that myth should be thrown away because the myths that they have, such as the Bible and other ancient religious texts, they're showing their age, because you can read the early chapters of the book of Genesis and you can know that certain things are now factually incorrect. But myth is still valuable. For instance, in the book of Genesis, it says that God created man out of the dust of the earth. Now, you might say, well, that's wrong. It is, but only in a sense. It's inaccurate. It's more accurate to say that the theory of evolution fills in the blanks where ancient man could only intuit his relationship to the world. It's quite a smart thing for an ancient man to say, God made man out of the dust of the ground, because it hints that we are of the stuff of the earth. That's the truth behind that. They just didn't know about the evolutionary process, right? So you could say, so what I've essentially done there is I've updated the myth to include the theory of evolution, and you would have heard me reading about how some creatures collaborate and some are hostile and their bodies are modified over time. and it all becomes more interesting and complex. So there's the detail. And it's not like it's not like the theory of evolution, the theory of natural selection, replaces myth with truth. It actually replaces myth with a much more detailed mythology. Science is the modern myth unrealized. What's different is you have a different scale of detail to play with. Another example is the Norse god Thor. So man sees the phenomenon of lightning and thunder, wonders what the source of this is, the mysterious source, so he invents a god because he doesn't know any better. So we know now that it's electricity and atmospheric pressure, but we've now got the greater scale of detail. But if you go into electricity and atmospheric pressure and you understand, okay, electricity has to be electromagnetism and down we go, you still end up, you end up talking about quarks and protons, neutrons, electrons, and all these subatomic particles and fundamental forces. You still don't get to the basis of what anything actually is. We don't have the theory of everything, and it's highly questionable whether we can get one. So we're essentially always playing with these abstractions that all relate to each other. They identify relationships with each other. We don't get to know what anything fundamentally is. The mystery always remains. So what I've done there is I've invented a myth, one that updates the book of Genesis. It starts off with the word God, but then I start to communicate a sense of what God is that's different from monotheism, because I talk about how being all powerful doesn't mean anything, being all seeing doesn't mean anything, because you're in the blinding light of your own glory. So I'm using anthropomorphism because it kind of gets me over a hurdle. What myth does is it gets you in the ballpark of where the truth is. It's not the truth, it just gets you in the ballpark. It's abstract thinking that makes use of whatever science is available, but it goes beyond that to kind of create a big picture. It's a bit like if you were standing in the fog and you were looking across a distance of about 20 or 30 meters, and you could just make out the shape of something, but you couldn't see it all, it was too vague. So instead of going, well, I'm just not going to think about what that is, you start to fill in the blanks with something so that you can get a sense of what it is in the mist, So that's what myth does. Now, it's very unfortunate that in the scientific climate today, people don't want abstract thinking. Well, that's not true at a high level, because Stephen Hawking, for instance, when he talks about multiple universes, that's abstract thinking. We don't know about these multiple universes. We theorize their existence. I'm not a fan of that idea really, but we theorize their existence because we have a hurdle to overcome, which is explaining the low entropy state at the beginning of this universe, right? Explaining the highly ordered state, that's what I mean, at the beginning of this universe. Give yourself many, many universes to play with, most of which fail, and you get one that works. You see, also, you can't really escape myth, because even if you don't believe that you want to use myth, you're playing with one anyway, but you just don't realize it. And it's the myth of the fully automatic universe. This is the myth that a lot of scientifically inclined people pick. The myth of the fully automatic deterministic universe, where there is nothing that cannot be categorized with equations that are absolutely deterministic. Like, consciousness is really just a big clockwork mechanism. There's nothing transcendent about it. You see? That's the myth. You don't know that that's true, so that's the myth of the fully automatic universe. I prefer the myth of the transcendent order, the mysterious transcendent order that I can't reach, but which gave rise to all this. So I use words like God in a deeply abstract way because I gotta name it as something or I can't talk about it. But I definitely don't mean the father figure from the Bible. I don't mean any kind of human-like consciousness whatsoever. I just use words that allude to that because I haven't got anything else. So what I read to you, I think, is in the general ballpark of where the truth lies. Now, I know this story about God peering into the bubble on one side and then peering into the other side. I'm not saying that's an event which happened. Part of the reason for that chapter was to kind of take a step back from all the complexities of the book and to give you a sense of how things are, especially if you want to communicate something to children that's not the Bible, right? Something a bit more meaningful that they would be able to understand. So this little story about the bubble and God peering into two sides of it and seeing himself and not recognizing himself, it's a colourful way of depicting how there was non-duality that ended up as duality in the Big Bang. This whole game of separateness that we play. And there's a lot of stuff in that myth that was, all of it was very carefully selected. Like, I wasn't picking anything just on a whim. It crystallizes quite a sophisticated appreciation of time as never having a beginning, never having an end. You know, if all the time in eternity is not going to get you anywhere else except the present moment. Think about that for a second. All the time in eternity doesn't take you anywhere except the present moment, because the only moment that anything ever happens in is the present moment. You see? I don't believe time had a beginning, don't believe it will have an end. I don't see it as a dimension that's stretched out like a big film reel. I just see it as a single moment that is this moment, that is always changing. So I crystallized that in the myth that I described to you. So I hope you find that interesting. Myth is important for the simple reason that some questions are too big for the human organism to answer. So you can sit with nothing, or you can think in such a way that gets you in the general ballpark of where the answer lies. All right, folks, take care.